Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Russia's failure in Ukraine are etched on the Kremlin walls. The anti-Putin deputies in Kremlin are holding leaflets holding Russian soldiers who lost their lives in Ukraine. And they are speaking against the Russian leader by going from room to room. Russian lawmakers argue that the time has come for Putin to face harsh realities. The Kremlin is boiling like a witch's cauldron. What happened in the Kremlin will be the subject of movies. The Kremlin walls continue to witness the intrigues, lies and backstabbing among the deputies. There is no trust left in the Kremlin for Russian leader Putin. Especially the Russian deputies in opposition are trying to undermine Russian leader Putin by using the Russian army's great defeat in Ukraine as an excuse. The Russian leader has no one left to trust in the whole country. After the Russian army entered Ukraine in February, the true face of his friends was revealed. Continuing his war in Ukraine alone, Putin needs a wall to lean on. Vladimir Putin's long-standing authority over the Russian Federation is about to crumble amid the murmur of immunity among top Kremlin figures. President Putin had promised Moscow forces would quickly seize Kiev, but nearly 9 months into the invasion of Ukraine, numerous Russian military failures since then have drawn fierce criticism. With the invasion plan under scrutiny, Putin is now about to risk losing his place at the top of the Kremlin as a civil war has erupted between the upper echelons of the Russian state. While criticism of the Russian president overblown, those close to Vladimir Putin are said to be not in league with the anti-Putin group. The Kremlin is one of the most secret places in the world. No one knows for sure what motivated Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. If US intelligence is correct, it looks like there may be division within the Kremlin due to Russian military's failures against the Ukrainian army. A source familiar with the Washington's recent briefing said, "It is a real-life house of cards, but they are all stabbed in the back. Nobody trusts anybody in Russia." Early in the Ukraine-Russian war, a mysterious figure named Yevgeny Prigozhin opposed Russian and was critical of the failures of the Russian military. But the cards were dealt again, and Yevgeny Prigozhin formed the Wagner Group, a special mercenary group used by the Russian government to assist in military operations. Wagner Group founder Yevgeny Prigozhin doesn't give up his habit in Ukraine. The Wagner Group is accused of involvement in war crimes committed in the country. Prigozhin has always denied any ties to the Kremlin, but was always described as Putin's chiefs after the catering company provided food to Moscow executives. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov even denied these allegations about Yevgeny Prigozhin. This information is fundamentally wrong. President Putin regularly holds meetings on the special military operation and all participants express different perspective in the working mode, he said. War experts in Russia made comments after Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov denied the allegations. Russian experts claimed that Yevgeny Prigozhin's main goal was to seize the seat of the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, in order to gain a seat in the Kremlin. Russian war commentators believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin wanted to embarrass Sergei Shoigu by performing better in Ukraine than the Russian army. Meanwhile, the US security source touched on other issues that could harm the Putin regime. The mobilization announced by Russian leader Putin continues to knit socks on the head of the Russian leader. It angered many in Russia that Russian reservists were sent to risk the lives they loved by mobilization. On the other hand, there are ultra-nationalist figures who want Putin to escalate the violence even further to nuclear attack. Putin is also struggling with friendly-looking officials inside. Russian leader Putin doesn't give up on those who try to direct him in the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin is walking a tightrope. Mobilization is not widely held in Russia, and all talk about continued and additional mobilization in the controlled information space is prohibited. Several senior officials want the war to end as Putin's ambitions are deemed unrealistic. Russian officials, who think that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is fake, want the Russian army to withdraw from Ukraine. Disappointment caused by Russia's lack of progress in Ukraine is on the agenda in the Russian media. Russian state television generally supports the Russian government, and while broadcasters are still reluctant to question Putin, this is starting to change. There is a growing scrutiny of the Russian military in the Russian media. Last month, prominent Russian journalist Alexander Saltkov covered the losses suffered in Russia's Donbas region. The situation is difficult. The Ukrainian armed forces are the peak of their capabilities due to mobilization they started in the spring, he said. The pro-Kremlin journalist added, "The Russian troops do not have enough manpower to stop the Ukrainian attacks." The last Russian losses are directly connected with it. It's a very difficult time on the front lines right now, he said. He added that the Ukrainian forces are at the front against the Russian army in the war and have a numerical advantage. He stated that they do not have problems with the data or high-precision weapons. The Russian journalist, implying the low number of Russian soldiers in Ukraine, said that they put their hopes on the newly recruited soldiers in the Russian army, and we expected them to be ready to fight and join the war. Russian leader Putin faced opposition within the Kremlin as Moscow's leading powers began to turn their backs on Vladimir Putin after poor results in Ukraine. The Russian journalist said the following about what happened in the Kremlin. The struggle against Putin started at the highest echelons of Russian power. We are witnessing the hunter's lunch, said. The Russian journalist continued, what is happening now is an important manifestation of the collapse within structures of power. Vladimir Putin has moved to silence opposition media outlets in Russia, even passing a law earlier this year that even allows long prison sentences if someone is found to be distributing information that the Kremlin considers deliberately false. In Russia, there is excessive pressure on independent media outlets in line with Putin's instructions. It is even known that some owners of independent media outlets could not stand Putin's continued pressure and left Russia. The detail underlining Russian President Putin's effort to limit the news of media outlets is the declaration of mobilization. What happened after Russian leader Putin's declaration of mobilization occupied the headlines of the Russian media for a long time. Putin was very uncomfortable with this situation, thinking that the news about the mobilization in the media has damaged his reputation. He is actually trying to take revenge on the Russian media. After Putin's love to silence opposition media outlets, some Russian journalists mustered up their courage and broke their silence. A dissident Russian journalist criticized the law passed by the Russian leader with his words. Russian journalist Putin declared that he can no longer act as a mediator between various interest groups, that the war all of against all has begun in Russia. I hope this war against Putin will overthrow this inhuman regime that is killing people in Ukraine and its own mobilized people in Russia, said. Vladimir Putin faced an unprecedented flood of widespread public protest last month after he announced the partial mobilization of Russian reserves. Demonstrators across the country took to the streets to protest the mobilization of 300,000 additional men to continue the invasion efforts in Ukraine. Although news of the opposition quickly made global headlines, the Kremlin promptly responded by arresting thousands of activists. In addition to what happened in Russia, Putin's war effort was tested by sabotage by Russian anti-war groups. Key rail networks used to transport Kremlin supplies across the border to Moscow. Soldiers were damaged in deliberate attacks, exacerbating existing difficulties in the military supply network. While the crisis of support for Putin continued in Russia, the Russian army began to take a stance against Putin. Troops mobilized into Russian military staged an anti-Putin protest at a training center in Russia earlier this week. The event was filmed and widely shared on social media. It was reported that the Russian soldiers took a stand after they did not receive the lump sum payment promised by the Kremlin for their enlistment. In the statements made by the United Kingdom in the past days, it was stated that the Russian soldiers had an extremely low morale. The reason for the protest by the Russian soldiers explains the demoralization of the Russian soldiers. In the coming days, we can see that the Ukrainian warriors, taking advantage of Russia's internal turmoil, cleared more Russian fronts from Russian soldiers and waved the Ukrainian flag. Thank you for watching us.